actually access the web admin side, the thick admin side, how to affect the system defaults, and how to create new users in the system. What we're going to do in this video is we're actually going to take a step back and take a look at some of the other types of codes that you can set up in the system. So this first video is going to focus mainly on the crime incident setup, setting up your incident code, setting up your crime codes in the system, and how you're going to do that. And here we are. So to get to the crime incident, it's going to be the very first option underneath our setup menu. So when I select crime incident, that's going to open up my crime incident setup screen. And this is where I can get to any and all crime codes that have been set up in my system. So if I hit my list once again at the top, I can switch around and I can figure out which code I want to modify. I can collapse my list back down and see exactly how that code is set up in the system. Now this screen is going to be very important because it's going to decide exactly how this code reacts in your system. So just putting a label of, in my case here, controlled substance drugs code, just putting a label of that on a case report doesn't do much. We want to be able to pull reports based off of the classification of drugs. We want to pull reports based off of crimes against society. We want to pull reports based off of the UCR, the NIBRs, the Clery codes that are going to be connected with all of these. And so this is where we're going to set up all those background kind of driving factors of my crime code to make sure that whenever it's used, the officer doesn't have to know the UCR code, the NIBRs code, the Clery code, and all those other codes. The system's going to automatically know all that, and it's going to automatically report it all for you correctly, once again, without having to force that knowledge on your day-to-day users. So let's kind of break this screen down so you can see exactly what goes into the crime code here. My first field here is my offense code. So this is going to be your shorthand. So whenever I'm typing in my code, I don't have to type out false present as controlled substance here. Or if I switch to a different code, let's say, let's find a shorter code here. Let's go as simple disturbing the peace. So I don't want to have to type out disturbing the peace every time I want to put in that code. So in my case here, I have an offense code of DIS TPC. Now this can be anything. This is not an official reporting metric here. You can put in whatever your officers will best know as the short form of that offense code. If it's something like a 10 code for a dispatch code, you could put that in. In my case here, it's more of just an abbreviation of DIS TPC. Now, that's going to be my shorthand code. Now, below there, you'll notice I have code section. So that's going to be where you actually put your criminal code or your penal code outline of the code itself. So that's going to be where you type that out, and that will appear on some official reports if you want it to. So you always want to make sure those are correct as well. Now, I'm going to skip a few down here. The next one we have is description. So whenever I print out a case report, what's the fully written out version of this code? What do I want it to say? In my case here, I want it to say disturbing the peace. If you want to change this, you can change it as much as you want. You can modify. Let's say you want it to be in all caps. Maybe you just want to capitalize the T and V. Whatever it is that you want to do, you can make those changes and hit save, and that'll actually commit those saves to the system there. Below there, I have my classification. Your classification, think of it like an umbrella code. So if you are running a report, you can run a report on disturbing the peace, which will be every time that code was used individually. Or if you have multiple types of disturbance calls, you can classify them under classification as disturbance. So now, rather than having to run a report on each single disturbance type of code, I can run a report just on the classification of disturbance and pull all that data at once. So that's going to save me time, it's going to save me effort. You're going to want to make sure your classifications are set up correctly. Now, what do I mean by correctly? Correctly is going to mean you want your classifications to be broad enough to where they're useful. If you have a different classification for every single description, that's not going to be useful because that's just going to group every code in a group of one, which you don't need to do. But you also don't want to make them too broad because you, once again, want to keep them useful. So if I made every single code in my system have a classification of offense, then that means if I ran a report based off my classifications, I'm not really pulling any meaningful stats. So as a department, you really have to kind of decide, how broad do I want to make these classifications in my system? Below there, I have my portal classification. Same exact spiel I just gave there. The only difference is this classification will actually affect if you're using the public mapping portal that we provide. That will give you the ability to classify them on the portal perhaps differently than you would classify them internally when you're not showing this to the public. We also have below there level of offense, standard 4 codes there: incident, misdemeanor, felony, other. And then if we move over to the right-hand side, I have my call timer, which is going to be how often CAD's going to notify the dispatcher that this call is active. So if I set this to 65, then that means if I have a disturbing the peace incident going on, every 65 minutes, the dispatcher is going to be notified that Unit 123 has been on scene at this disturbing the peace for an hour and 5 minutes without being updated. The next one below there is call priority. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but basically your call priority is going to decide how high or low your call appears on the open calls list. So a higher priority call is going to appear towards the top, a lower priority call is going to appear towards the bottom. So those are your basic incident fields. So those are the things you're going to need pretty much on any type of code that you're putting in. Now there's a bunch of other information on the screen. So let's break this down so you can actually see what all the different reports and mechanisms are behind these other fields. So if we go back up here to the top, we have our UCR data. If you're reporting UCR, you'll want to make sure that you have your UCR data code correct in here. Now this is just a text field, so you can type in your UCR data code directly into here. Now if we look a little bit diagonal down from here, we have the Clery Act data. Notice my field is a little yellow. That's because that's a code list. We'll get to that, what that means in a little bit here. But your code list is basically saying that there is a specific list of things that are acceptable here. Now, if I don't know them, or if I'm curious as to what the options are, I can always hit a question mark and hit tab in any of these yellow fields, and that will open up a list of all possibilities to put into that field. So if for whatever example I wanted to put in larceny for this, I double click larceny and that's been put in there now. I can back it out just like a text field to take it back out again. So that one is a little bit different than the UCR data because you have to actually use a code that's already built into the system. Below there, we have our UCR offense. The UCR offense is going to be used if you're reporting NIBRs. So your UCR offense code may be different from your UCR data code, depending on if your department is filling out UCR reports or filling out NIBRs reports for your department. Now, if we keep looking down, we have a standard operating procedure button here. So if I save what I've done so far, I can now click on my standard operating procedure button. And this is where I can actually type out what I want the dispatchers to be told whenever they start up this type of call. This could be anything as simple as, please notify John Smith in the case of a disturbing the peace call. We could have questions for the dispatcher to ask the reporting party in the case of a disturbing the peace call. We could have numbers for that person to call in case of a disturbing the peace call. So whatever information you want your dispatchers to see whenever they put in this type of call, this is where you could put that in. Now, we can also filter out based off your unit types. So when you're setting up units in the system, you can assign them to different unit types. And then what this would do is if the dispatcher chooses to filter, then that means that if I have a unit type of F in the system, then whenever I have a disturbing the peace call, it's going to automatically filter the screen out to only show the dispatcher the types of units you want them to assign to that type of call. Now, the final part down here at the bottom is a bunch of checkboxes. The easiest way to kind of traverse this is draw an imaginary line down the center. Everything to the left-hand side is going to be checkboxes that control what reports, when printed, does this crime code appear on. So if I run a media log, do I want this crime code to appear on my media log? If I'm reporting Clery, do I want this crime code to appear on my Clery daily log? For NIBRs, if I'm running a report for crime against person, property, society, where do I want this code to fall? So all of these are going to control your kind of official reporting mechanisms in ARMS. Some of them, like drug law, liquor law, and weapons, are going to be required for Clery reporting. So you always want to make sure you check any appropriate boxes that apply to your code. Now you can also come down here and mark the code as inactive, which is basically just saying that I don't want anybody to use this code, but I don't want to delete this code because it's been used before and I don't want to leave a hole in my data somewhere where this code used to be. So now if we go to the right-hand side of our imaginary line, these checkboxes to the right all control where this code is accessible in the system. So what that means is, in my example here, I do not have a checkbox next to computer-aided dispatch, but I do have a check next to case management. This means that a dispatcher cannot create a call for disturbing the peace, but an officer could add that code to their case report, or could arrest somebody, or could issue a warrant, a restraining order, a trespass order, so on. So these are controlling which users will have access to the code and where. Now, why would you do this? Why would you cut out codes from one area to another? Since this is a section where you can put in any code in the system, could be a CAD code, could be a case management code, could be an arrest code, the list can get long. So by checking these appropriately, you're shortening the list that your users have to sort through, and you're making it easier for them to pick the correct codes. If you only gave everybody every code in the system, then you're not as locked down as far as keeping people from putting the wrong types of codes on the wrong types of reports. Now let's take a little bit more of a practical example with this. The system, by using these checkboxes, will also police the officers. So for example, the one I always use in training is burglary. So if I have a burglary code set up in my system, I'll have more than one. I'll have several, a whole bunch of burglary codes. Now, if I'm a dispatcher, I'm only worried about two types of burglary codes. I'm worried about burglary to report and burglary in progress. I don't want my dispatcher to have to sort through 30 different burglary codes to get to the code they need. So I would mark those codes as computer-aided dispatch, my burglary to report and my burglary in progress, but not in case management. Because once the dispatcher issues that case report, I want the officer to be forced to pick a correct code. So what will happen is the dispatcher puts in burglary to report on their CAD event. They issue a case report that will now have the crime code of burglary to report on it. However, burglary to report won't have case management check next to it. So when the officer actually gets to their case report and tries to modify it and work on it, the system's going to alert the officer and let them know, hey, burglary to report is not a valid case management code. You need to change this to an appropriate code. Then they'll be able to look through their list of case management burglary codes to find the correct one for the case report. So it's going to force the officer's hand to put in a more correct code than the one the dispatcher put in originally. So once you've gone through and you've actually reviewed all these different fields for your incidents, now my officers don't have to worry about which codes are correct codes for cases. My officers don't have to worry about the UCR data codes, the NIBRS codes, the Clery codes. My dispatchers don't have to sort through big long lists. So by really curating this list and controlling what appears in it, you're making the entire job of everybody else, dispatcher, officers, record clerks, anybody, a lot easier to handle because you're taking away a lot of the gotcha moments of filling out a case report. So hopefully by the time this data goes through CAD, goes through case, goes through arrest, it's going to have all the correct data on it, and you're not going to have to make as many corrections on it at the end of the day.